Oh, long time no see. What do we have here? What is going on, everybody? Welcome back. As you can see, the Camaro is finally back here. Today I'm going to be installing the clutch with my buddy James. He invited me over to use his lift, which is going to make this job a breeze, and the entire video is pretty much going to be time-lapse, just with me talking over it. It's kind of difficult to film and do a job like this. It just takes up a lot of time kind of stopping to explain stuff, and he was kind enough to let me use his lift, so I wanted to make this as smooth as possible, so I just kind of time-lapsed everything. But there are a few points I'm going to go over because I did run into some problems, and I am going to guide you guys through what I'm doing in each segment here. But first step is to remove this Y pipe. For any of you guys who aren't familiar with the channel or this Camaro and just kind of know me by the Tahoe, I'm going to post a link to a playlist for this car right there at the top of the screen. So if you want to go check it out, see all the work I've been doing to it, see what's to come, definitely go check that out because you guys are going to see a lot of this car along with the Tahoe and the Trans Am. But with the Y pipe out of the way, I then came in here and removed all the bolts at the back yoke for the drive shaft. Then I pulled out the two long bolts that pass through the rear ends that hold the torque arm to the rear end housing itself. With that out of the way, I just came in there with a little bit of a PB blaster and sprayed it inside the torque arm bushing, then the whole thing just slipped right out. Before I could get to that last bolt in the drive shaft, I had to lower the car down and take the parking brake off so I can rotate it. But with that done, I was able to get to the last bolt, and before I actually pulled the shaft out of the transmission, thankfully I remembered and drained the fluid first. So before I go any farther here, I just want to mention probably the first step in a job like this is going to be to go inside the car and remove the shifter from the transmission. Now, the way I wired my meth injection up, it was going to be a complete pain in the ass to try to pull the console out just because I wired it through the console, and I would have had to cut the harness and resolder it, and it was going to be a big mess. So I decided to just pull the shifter boot and just remove the kind of Johnson rod that, you know, bolts to it and actually the knob screws onto.
Well, of course they're trying to screw you. What do you think? That's what they do. They can make up anything. Nobody knows. By the way, you need a new Johnson rod in here. Oh, Johnson rod. Yeah, well, you better put one of those on.
That's connected to the shifter, and that I'm hoping is going to give me enough clearance to drop this down. Being this car used to be an automatic, I custom cut the hole for the transmission. I didn't make it as big as like a factory car, so that shifter does have to come out in order to get the transmission to come down and not get the shifter like hooked on the hole in the transmission tunnel. But once that's done, right here I'm coming in and removing the bolts that hold the transmission to the bell housing. Now, being this is a T56, it has a separate bell housing that could come off of the transmission itself. So it's really easy just to come in here and disconnect the transmission from the bell housing, slip the whole assembly out, and then you can easily get to all the bell housing bolts, being you don't have the transmission in the way. Also, before I started removing these bolts, you can see there the clutch cable. I'm sorry, not the cable, the hydraulic hose right below the left side exhaust collector. I disconnected that to get that out of the way because if you guys have an LT1 car or a 93 to a 97 T56, you're going to have your slave cylinder on the outside of the bell housing, whereas the 98 to 02 LS1 style T56s have it inside, and it has that hose that has like a little quick disconnect that connects right to the slave cylinder through the bell housing. But aside from that, the only other connections that really have to come off are electrical. So you have the reverse lockout solenoid, the vehicle speed sensor, the little switch for the reverse lights. Just pretty much go around the transmission. Any obvious connectors that you have on there that are going to prevent the transmission from coming out or are just connected to the housing itself, just disconnect all that stuff, get that out of the way. You can see here I'm ready to pretty much pull the transmission out. I got all the bolts holding it to the bell housing out. I just zipped the cross member bolts out, got the cross member out of the way, and we're pretty much ready to slide this thing out. The only thing I'm running into here is what I mentioned earlier with the shifter, because I still have the shifter connected up there, and I'm trying to lower the thing out and slide the transmission away from the engine, but the actual housing on the shifter is hitting the back of the square hole for on the transmission tunnel where the shifter passes through. So right now I'm just going to come in here with the transmission low enough I could get in there with a little ratchet and ratchet those 4 bolts out, and then I could kind of push the shifter up out of the transmission and then just slide the transmission out while leaving the shifter kind of up there in the boot. Once again, the reason I didn't do this beforehand is because my center console and have everything wired through there is just going to be more work to try to remove the center console and get the shifter out that way than just to come in here and remove it this way. But that was it. That was the last thing keeping this thing from coming out, with the bell housing to transmission bolts out and all the connections off, drive shaft out, torque arm. That's it. Transmission just slides right out. Very straightforward. I love manual transmissions for that reason. They're very easy to replace. I mean, any rear wheel drive car is relatively simple, but just not having to deal with like a torque converter bolts, having to spin the motor over, you know, removing transmission cooler lines that could get rusted in. Then you get some cars, like these cars with a 700 R4, they don't even have a drain plug. You have to remove the pan, just get the fluid out. Stuff like that. I think the manual is just superior when it comes to having to actually service them and remove them. But with the transmission out of the way, we just came in here to take a look at that slippy old McLeod. Now, remember guys, I do have the RST, which is the lower model, to the higher performance RXT that holds more power. So who knows, if I had that clutch, maybe it would have held on. But we are going to be pulling this thing out to install my triple disc monster. Also, one thing I want to mention here, because I know somebody's going to point it out, my buddy James here, who isn't helping me with anything, he has a problem with his neck where he pinched a nerve and he can like barely move his neck. So that's why I'm doing pretty much all of the leg work here. So I know a lot of people are going to pick up on that and be like, why isn't he doing any work? Oh, why does he keep watching you? That's the reason why. But now with the transmission out of the way, you can see how easy it is to get to these bell housing bolts. I mean, right there, you just go around the perimeter of the bell housing, zip all those bolts out, and then you'll have access to your flywheel and your clutch and all that good stuff. But even after getting all those bolts out, you can see I still couldn't get the bell housing out. It kept getting caught on the passenger side oxygen sensor. So I just came in here off camera, removed that sensor, and then the bell housing slipped right out. So I started removing the pressure plate here, but the camera kind of went dead. So we're going to skip right ahead to the clutch being removed and the flywheel coming off. Now, in addition to throwing a new clutch and flywheel in here, I'm also changing the pilot bearing slash bushing. That's the little bearing that you can see right in the center of the flywheel there. That's in the back of the crankshaft. The input shaft, the very end of the input shaft from the transmission, sits inside of there and rides on that bearing. So we're going to be replacing that bearing. It comes with the Monster clutch kit, as well as that rear main seal, because this engine had approximately 90,000 miles on it when I put it in about 5 years ago. I don't know how many it has on it now, well over 100 for sure. If I had to guess, I would say somewhere between 130 to 150 possibly. So I don't want to put an $1,800 clutch in this thing with that old rear main seal and risk it blowing out, especially now that the engine is under boost. But the way I replace these rear main seals, I just pull the whole cover. I'm sure there are little tiny notches around the housing where the seal is. I'm sure you could probably get in there with a flathead and just kind of pull it out. The way I do it is just remove the whole cover. Then you could just hit the seal out from the back. You know, it'll give you a little look inside the back of the engine, see if anything looks weird while you're in there. And then it's really easy just to put the cover back on and use the alignment tool to center the cover, tighten it down, and then just press the seal right in. But speaking about things looking weird, if you take a close look at the rear left oil pan bolt right on the corner of the block there, by the center of my left forearm, where the pan kind of bends up, there's actually a slight crack in the end of the pan that I can only see with the transmission removed. I didn't do anything about this. I'm probably going to have to replace that oil pan eventually. Maybe I over torqued it when I installed it 5 years ago, who knows. But you can see here quite a bit of oil is coming out when I got this cover off, so I'm kind of axing for an oil drain pan because it's leaking all over the floor while I'm holding this cover from falling off. But we got the pan under there and I was able to slip this thing off. I did remove those two really long bolts that go up through the oil pan and into the cover, so you want to get those out of there, and all the bolts that hold the cover to the block, and then you can just pull the thing right off. And just like magic, everything is clean. I got the new gasket on there. Actually, no, I'm sorry, I recycled the old gasket. I didn't replace it. I got the cleaned old gasket back on there. I put the little bit of RTV between the block surface and the oil pan surface, and then we're just going to get this cover back on here, put all of the bolts in loosely, and then that's when we're going to come in here with the alignment tool and tighten this thing down before putting the new rear main in. So here's the alignment tool that I picked up specifically for these engines. Now it's just this like round kind of spacer thing with an O-ring. It just sits snug against the crankshaft and the cover and just kind of locates it so it's perfectly centered around the crankshaft. Then you could go in there, tighten all the bolts down, pull that tool off the crank, and then that pretty much ensures you have the perfect amount of space around the entire crankshaft in correlation to the cover. So when you put the seal on there, you don't have to worry about run into any potential issues with this thing leaking. I mean, you could probably do this without this tool. I just picked it up because I wanted to make sure I wasn't going to run into any problems with this thing leaking all over my new clutch, or having to pull the trans again after doing this big job. But with the cover all torqued down, we're ready to pop the rear main in. Now, this thing went in without a problem, and you definitely want to pay close attention because there is an inside and an outside, and it's labeled in very, very tiny letters, kind of stamped into the seal. So take a look at it and make sure you install it the right way. But yeah, this seal went in without a problem. I just was able to push it in with my fingers, made sure it was all perfectly flush with the outside cover. One side wasn't any deeper than the other. Then I just came in with a flathead and just kind of pressed down on it all the way around just to make sure it was perfectly even, and that was it. We were ready to go ahead and replace that pilot bushing. Alright, the pilot bushing. Now, this is always fun to do. They make a tool that kind of goes in there and opens up, and you can just kind of pull the thing out from the crank, but this is always fun doing it this way. Right now I'm using a grease gun. I'm just pumping the cavity behind the pilot bearing full of grease, and the idea behind this is I'm going to come in here with my steel clutch alignment tool. I mean, the alignment tool is pretty much an input shaft, and it's the exact same diameter of the inside of that bearing. I'm just going to hammer on that, and being the grease isn't going to compress, it's actually going to get pushed in there, and that is going to push against the back of the bearing and drive it out. In theory, that's how it's supposed to work. I've done this before with wet toilet paper. I'd never done it with grease. This is my first time trying it out. A lot of guys do it with wet bread as well, just wet some bread and stuff it in there. The grease wasn't working for me. I was hitting on this thing, putting more grease, hitting on it. It was just kind of bouncing back off the grease, and it wasn't driving the bearing out. So I ditched the whole grease plan and went to the toilet paper idea, which I had done in the past and I know worked, and that worked like a charm. I just kind of wet the toilet paper, stuffed it in there, hammered it a little bit, the bearing started coming out, wet some more, stuffed it in there, and just did that until the bearing came out, came in there, cleaned all the grease and toilet paper mess out, and then we were ready to just drive the new bearing in. Then moving on, we were finally ready to install the new shiny stuff. So I have the flywheel here. This is a billet flywheel that came with the Monster triple disc kit. Now I'm coming in here and installing the kind of grinded down headed bolts that came with the kit. You do not want to use ARP bolts with this. It specifically says that in the instructions, so they provide you with these bolts, and these are the ones you need to use because the ARPs are going to sit too tall and they are going to come in contact with that bottom disc. So I'm just getting these guys torqued down, and then before we get to installing any of the discs or the transmission, we're just going to go and give this thing a startup just to make sure the rear main seal isn't open. Hey, plus it's open headers, it's going to be nice to hear what it sounds like. Alright, so anybody who's interested in knowing what cam I have in the car, I get that question once in a while, is a TIC Performance Stage 2 Turbo Cam, which as you can hear with the exhaust off, it sounds pretty lopey. You can hear that it has a cam. When the exhaust is on most of the time, you won't even know the car has a cam. Being it is a turbo cam, it is very smooth, it is not very lopey. I notice it, but a lot of people who hear clips of the car online, they don't even know the thing has a cam just because of how smooth it idles. But installing this clutch here, I'm just test fitting the little spacers that go around the outside. Now when you pull this thing out of the box, you want to mark these because they need to go in the exact same spots where they came out. They were machined for those specific spots, so you want to mark them with a marker and put them back where you took them out when you because you have to disassemble this thing to take it apart to install the flywheel, and then obviously you have to put it back together before you put the transmission in the car, so you want to make sure everything goes back together the way it came apart. But now getting to installing the clutch, the lower disc is going on, followed by this plate that sits between the discs, and you can see there I have my metal alignment tool sitting inside the pilot bushing. That's going to make sure everything is perfectly aligned with the center of the crankshaft. Then these spacers all go along the outside, and that is what is going to hold the pressure plate. Then just running through this quick, we're going to continue stacking the discs up and getting the pressure plate installed. Then obviously you want to torque this thing down to whatever Monster recommends. I don't have the torque spec off hand right now. I did follow the instructions, and they do have it in the instruction manual. You want to make sure you follow everything that says, because this is a pretty intricate kind of operation here with all these discs and the spacers and everything. You want to make sure you install this correctly, and most importantly, torque this stuff down to where it's supposed to be and what the manufacturer, them being Monster, suggests. Now I assure you I did torque that pressure plate down. Just for some reason I have about 2 or 3 files in here that are corrupted and I can't open, but it doesn't look like I lost anything too important. So right now we're jumping over to the transmission and we're getting this slave cylinder replaced. Here's what I mentioned earlier about the LS1 style transmissions, where you actually have the slave cylinder inside of the bell housing and it bolts to the transmission that way. And you can see on the side there, that's where the hydraulic hose comes in and connects to it. And if you had the earlier style transmission with the LT1 cars, you would just have a fork in there that connects to a throwout bearing, and the hydraulic part itself would be on the outside of the transmission. Now I did run into a little problem here where the OEM bolts were too long for this slave cylinder, so I just ended up putting some washers around the top of the bolts just to make sure that I'll be able to tighten the thing down and the bolts aren't going to bottom out before the thing actually got tight. But that seemed to work without a problem. That large hose at the top there, you see coming out the top hole, the bottom one is where the master cylinder hose connects to. The top one, I actually got this kit with a remote bleeder. So there's a really long hose that actually reaches up to the engine bay and has a bleeder screw on the end. So you can actually bleed this thing from the engine bay, because everybody knows these cars have the worst location for bleeding the clutch. It is absolutely terrible. I actually made a hole in the side of my transmission tunnel just to bleed this thing, and the last time I tried to bleed it with the factory slave cylinder, the bleeder just snapped off. So I really had no way of bleeding it. I was just pumping the pedal for like a half hour to get the air out of it. Right here, we're trying to figure out how to get this measurement, because in the instructions they mentioned that you need to measure the distance between the front of the compressed slave cylinder. So with the slave cylinder fully bottomed against the transmission case, the height from there to the surface where it connects to the bell housing, you have to measure that distance. Then you have to measure the distance on the car from the fingers, the highest point of the fingers of the pressure plate, to that surface where the transmission will bolt to the bell housing. And you have to like take the difference between those numbers, and it can't be any more than like 1/1000th of an inch. We were trying to figure out a way to measure this, and we didn't have any kind of straight edge or any, accurate way to get this measurement. So I decided just to throw it back together without measuring this. Now I advise against doing this. The reason I didn't care too much and I just went ahead and did it is because in the instruction they said if you're using a factory bell housing, meaning not like a QuickTime or a scatter shield or an aftermarket bell housing of any kind, usually most of the time you don't have to shim this. And as you guys knew, I was going to be installing a QuickTime scatter shield, but unfortunately it just didn't fit. It was way too big and it was hitting the headers, and I would have had to like notch a good amount off to get it to fit. Plus I was using the lift. We were trying to get this done in like a day. I didn't want to have to risk cutting up this $700 bell housing and then the thing still didn't fit, or I ran into some other problem after that and it was already cut up and I had to get rid of it anyway. So I just decided to try to figure out an alternative later on and just throw it back together with the factory bell housing. So I didn't bother trying to do any shimming or go track down a straight edge or anything like that. But don't worry, any of you guys who want kind of a more detailed look at this job, we're going to be pulling this transmission again, and I'm probably going to be shooting it in the Tahoe format without a voiceover, and we're going to be cutting up that scatter shield and getting it to fit, because there is no alternative for a scatter shield as far as a manual transmission with an LS1 or any LS engine for that matter. In the 3rd gen, pretty much that's like the only scatter shield that they offer. I mean, there's a McLeod that was floating around for a while. I can't find it, and from what I can see, it really wasn't that good. So yeah, we're going to be pulling this transmission out in an upcoming video and getting that scatter shield to fit and getting that new Mufflex exhaust installed as well. But right now we're getting this thing slipped back into place, and right after this I think we're just going to go ahead, time lapse and montage the rest of the thing up until the final startup, because obviously everything else is just putting the drive shaft back in, you know, the exhaust back together, all the electrical connectors, all that stuff, pretty much opposite of what you guys already saw. The actual installation of the clutch is done, but as you can see here, this thing slipped right in without a problem. I just got it as lined up as good as I can, gave it a little shove from the back, and boom, popped right in, slipped against the bell housing, and we're ready to bolt the thing back together. Alright, so I think I'm going to cut this one up into 2 parts. I just realized I'm at about 20 minutes right now, and I completely forgot I went and installed the drive shaft loop before finishing this all up, and I want to show you guys what I did as far as that went. So I'm going to split this up into 2 parts. You guys will see part 2 no later than Tuesday. I don't want to waste 2 weeks on this because I have a lot of other videos that need to be edited, stuff with the Trans Am. So just be sure to check back in on Tuesday. I promise you guys I'll have part 2 on this out, and then we'll most likely have Trans Am, I think it's episode 4, where we tackle the rear brakes. That's going to be coming out next Friday. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm sorry if it seems a little boring with me just talking about technical stuff. I was kind of putting this video on the back burner just because it's a little bit of a boring one. I'd rather be kind of talking to you guys real time and, you know, showing you what I do, like as far as the Tahoe goes and problems I run into. I'm actually considering going back to that style for the Trans Am videos. Leave a comment below if you guys would like to see that, or you want me to continue with the voiceover, just because it's more my style, just to do it real time and let you guys know what's happening and the problems I run into, instead of giving you this really like fancy polished video at the end that takes a lot more time to edit and do a voiceover on. But regardless, more Trans Am videos will be coming. I still have the taillights, the headlights, the steering wheels going to the Tahoe. I've been saying this for weeks, but yeah, that stuff's all going to be going in. So there's a lot of good stuff to come on all 3 of these cars, so be sure to stay tuned for all that's going to be coming. But if you guys want to pick up that sweet ass hoodie that I'm wearing right there, link to that is going to be on the screen, as well as that subscribe button and a couple of other videos you might want to check out if you are new to the channel. But I think that is going to do it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, please be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and I'll see you on Tuesday.